You've definitely seen them in movies, right? The charming but totally ruthless villain, or the con artist who just doesn't seem to feel any guilt. Well, what if I told you that's not just some character trope? Today, we are going to break down the real-world clinical profile of antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD for short. So let's just dive right in.
But first, I want to start with a question that really gets to the core of all this. What does it actually mean to not feel remorse? I mean, to really, truly hurt someone, to lie to them, to manipulate them, and feel absolutely nothing? Just let that sink in for a second, because that idea is absolutely central to understanding this incredibly complex disorder.
Okay, so let's kick things off with the part of the disorder you can actually see, the external behaviors. And I want to be clear, this isn't about someone having a bad day or making one poor choice. We're talking about a consistent, pervasive pattern of just disregarding other people.
First up, there's deceitfulness. And look, we're not just talking about little white lies here. This is a pattern of repeated lying, of using different names, of conning people for personal profit, or sometimes just for the fun of it. It's a fundamental part of how they interact with the world.
Next, you've got this profound impulsivity. This shows up as a total failure to plan ahead. Actions are just taken on a whim, with zero thought for the consequences. Not for themselves, and definitely not for anyone else who's going to get caught in the fallout.
And that impulsivity, it's often paired with being really irritable and aggressive. This can lead to getting into physical fights or assaults over and over again. They have a super low frustration tolerance, which means conflicts can escalate from 0 to 60 physically in no time.
And you can see how these traits just build on each other, right? They create this really destructive pattern. There's a failure to follow laws, consistent irresponsibility when it comes to jobs or money, and a reckless disregard for their own safety and the safety of others. But the thing that really ties this all together is a profound lack of remorse. It's the ability to hurt, mistreat, or steal from someone and feel completely indifferent, or maybe even like they were justified in doing it.
So you see all these behaviors, but how does a clinician go from just observing them to making an actual formal diagnosis? Well, let's take a look at the clinical framework they have to use.
The official definition itself is really telling. The key phrases you need to hear are pervasive pattern, which means it's woven into the very fabric of their personality, and violation of the rights of others. This isn't just about being rude. It's about actively trampling on other people's safety, their property, and their well-being.
Yeah, a diagnosis of ASPD is not made lightly. Clinicians have to follow a very strict checklist. The person has to show at least 3 of those core behaviors we've been talking about. They have to be over 18, and, this is key, they have to show a history of similar behaviors before they were 15. It's also super important to rule out other conditions like schizophrenia or a bipolar episode.
This timeline is absolutely critical. I mean, ASPD doesn't just appear out of thin air in adulthood. The roots have to be traceable all the way back to childhood in the form of what's called conduct disorder, which is its own pattern of aggression, theft, and seriously breaking rules. If that childhood history isn't there, a diagnosis of ASPD simply cannot be made.
Now, this is interesting. There's also a really striking gender disparity when it comes to ASPD diagnoses. The data shows that males are 3 to 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with the disorder than females. And that raises some fascinating questions, Does the disorder maybe show up differently in men and women? Or is there a potential diagnostic bias happening where male aggression is just more quickly labeled as antisocial?
So while the overall number of people with ASPD in the general population is pretty low, we're talking around 1 to 4%, that number just skyrockets in certain environments. For example, in prison populations, the rates of ASPD are way, way higher, which kind of makes sense when you think about how the diagnosis focuses on unlawful behavior.
So this brings us to a huge question. What causes ASPD? Why does one person develop this disorder while someone else doesn't? Well, like with a lot of psychological conditions, the answer is a really complex mix of different factors.
But the thing is, there's no single cause. It's more like a perfect storm of 3 key areas. Biologically, there can be a genetic link, a naturally low fear response, and even abnormalities in the parts of the brain that handle impulse control and emotion, like the prefrontal cortex. Psychologically, there's a huge deficit in empathy and moral development. And then, critically, all of that is often layered on top of environmental factors like childhood abuse, neglect, or being exposed to a lot of violence.
So, as you can probably imagine, a life that's defined by all these traits is going to be a life filled with some profound complications, both for the person themselves and for absolutely everyone around them.
But before we dive into those consequences, let's clear up a common point of confusion: the difference between ASPD and narcissistic personality disorder. Okay, so both involve a lack of empathy, but their motivations underneath it all are pretty distinct. With ASPD, the driver is often personal gain or just satisfying an impulse. With narcissistic PD, it's all about feeding a need for admiration. It's a really key distinction to keep in mind.
The consequences of ASPD are frankly devastating. They create this huge ripple effect of chaos. We see really high rates of incarceration since unlawful behavior is literally one of the diagnostic features. There's a strong link with substance abuse disorders. That same impulsivity and irresponsibility make it nearly impossible to hold down a job or maintain stable relationships. And most tragically, this whole destructive path often leads to a much higher risk of dying young, whether it's from accidents, violence, or suicide.
And that leads us to the final and maybe the most difficult part of our explainer: the challenge of treatment. I mean, what can actually be done?
So right off the bat, the goal of treatment is usually management, not a cure. Psychotherapy like CBT can try to help someone manage their anger and think through consequences. Medications can be used to target specific symptoms like aggression, but there's no pill for a lack of empathy. Often the most effective approach ends up being highly structured environments and some form of legal supervision. And really, the fundamental challenge of treating ASPD is captured perfectly right here. The very nature of the disorder, the lack of insight, the lack of motivation to change, it works directly against any kind of therapy. I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't believe you have a problem, why on earth would you ever seek help for it?
And so, that leaves us with this really profound question. When a disorder has such deep roots in someone's biology and their personal history, where do we even begin to draw the line between accountability and pathology? It's an incredibly complex issue, and there are just no easy answers. Thanks for joining us.